I took the train that night because it was cheaper. A long-distance route, slow and mostly empty, but it was the easiest way to get home. It was supposed to be uneventful, just another late ride through the countryside, the hum of the tracks lulling me into sleep. Instead, I met her. She sat next to me even though the train car was mostly empty. I barely looked up at first, just enough to see dark hair, a slim frame, a soft floral scent that lingered as she settled in. I hate traveling alone. Her voice was smooth, too friendly for a stranger. I glanced over and forced a polite smile. "Yeah, I guess it can be lonely," I replied. She smiled, a little too wide. "You don't mind the company, do you?" I didn't. Not at first. She introduced herself as Emma, told me she was heading home after visiting her family, asked me where I was from, what I did, if I traveled often. At first, it felt normal, but the questions kept coming. Too personal, too specific. "Are you seeing anyone? Do you live alone? What stop are you getting off at?" I laughed awkwardly, trying to redirect the conversation, but she just tilted her head slightly, studying me. "I like your hands," she said suddenly. I blinked. Thanks." She smiled again. "They look strong. Capable." A weird compliment, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just awkward. Then she started talking about her childhood, about how her father used to lock her in the basement when she was bad, about how her mother would whisper strange prayers over her while she slept. I just sat there, nodding stiffly, waiting for her to change the subject. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "People always leave me. But you wouldn't do that, right?" I forced a laugh. "Well, I mean, we're on the same train, so I can't really go anywhere." Her smile didn't falter. Not yet. Something about the way she said it sent a cold ripple down my spine. The train lurched, slowing as we approached a small, deserted station. A few people stepped off, but almost no one got on. I saw my chance. "I think I'm going to stretch my legs for a minute," I said, standing up. Her hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was cold, unyielding. "You don't have to do that," she said. I hesitated. The way she was looking at me, too intense, too expectant, made my skin crawl. I slowly pulled my arm away. "I won't be long." I stepped onto the platform, breathing in the cool night air. My heart was hammering. I had only been talking to her for maybe an hour, but something felt wrong. I glanced back through the window. She was watching me. Her expression was blank, unblinking. I needed to get away from her. But then the train gave a loud warning chime. Boarding was ending. If I stayed off now, I'd be stranded in the middle of nowhere. So, stupidly, I got back on. This time, I sat a few rows away. She didn't move, didn't call me back. I thought I was safe. Then, about 10 minutes later, I felt it. A presence behind me. I turned my head slowly. She was standing right behind my seat, staring down at me. "Did you get lost?" she asked, tilting her head. Her voice was too light, too playful, like she was pretending not to be angry. "I just wanted a different view," I said, forcing a chuckle. Her smile faltered. "That's okay. I'll sit with you again." I wanted to say no, but something about her expression made me too afraid to push her away. She slid into the seat beside me again. "You seem nervous," she said softly. I shook my head quickly. "No, just tired." She leaned in too close, lowering her voice. "You should sleep. I'll watch over you." I swallowed hard. "That's really not necessary." Her lips twitched, like she was trying not to laugh. "I wouldn't hurt you, you know? I just like being close to you." I did not sleep. The train rocked along, the dark countryside blurring past the window. Occasionally, she would hum to herself. A soft, eerie tune I didn't recognize. Then, somewhere around 2 a.m., she whispered something that made my entire body go rigid. "I think I was meant to meet you." I didn't respond. "I think," she continued, her voice barely above a breath, "I was supposed to find someone like you." I gripped the armrest. "You remind me of someone." I forced myself to look at her. "Who?" Her smile grew wider. "My last boyfriend." I swallowed. "Oh, yeah. You didn't want to stay with me either." My skin prickled. "What happened to him?" Her gaze darkened. "He ran." Silence stretched between us. Then she tilted her head, looking at me expectantly. "But you wouldn't do that, right?" I forced a laugh. "No, of course not." I spent the next hour barely breathing, waiting for my stop. When the train finally slowed, I sprang to my feet. "Well, this is me," I said, trying to sound casual. She grabbed my hand. "I'll come with you." My breath caught. "You, what?" "I don't want to say goodbye yet." The train came to a full stop. People were moving, getting off. I knew I had seconds to act. I forced a smile. Actually, I just realized I left something back at my seat. I pulled away from her grip, pretending to head back. The second she turned to follow me, I bolted. I jumped off the train just as the doors were closing, heart pounding out of my chest. Through the window, I saw her face. For the first time, her smile was gone, and in its place was something dark, empty, cold. The train pulled away. I thought it was over. Then, an hour later, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Where did you go? I never gave her my number, and I never took that train again. The train ride was supposed to be simple. It was late, and my cousin, Jake, and I were heading home from a weekend trip. The only train available was a slow overnight route, stopping in small, forgotten towns along the way. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheap, and after a long trip, all we wanted was to sleep until we reached our stop. The train itself felt old, dim lighting, cracked plastic seats, and windows coated in a thin layer of grime. It smelled faintly of mildew and metal, and the air was thick with the scent of too many bodies crammed together for too long. We found 2 seats in the middle of the car, directly across from an elderly woman who looked half asleep, her head tilted forward in a way that made her neck disappear into her sweater. The rest of the car was relatively empty, aside from a few scattered passengers keeping to themselves. Then he walked in. The moment he stepped onto the train, I felt it. Something about him was wrong. His clothes were rumpled, stained in places I didn't want to think about, and he clutched a half-empty can of beer in one hand, his fingers twitching around the metal like he couldn't decide whether to crush it or drink it. His eyes were too wide, unfocused but searching, like he was looking for something specific. Or someone. I prayed he'd keep walking. He didn't. He stumbled toward our section, swaying slightly with the movement of the train, and dropped into the seat directly across from Jake. For a few minutes, he just sat there, staring at nothing. Then he leaned forward, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Jake's. "You ever kill a man?" he slurred. The question hit like a slap. Jake blinked, visibly tensing. No." The man grinned, his teeth yellow and uneven. "I have." My stomach tightened. Jake forced a laugh, clearly trying to brush it off. "All right, man." The guy's grin didn't falter. He just leaned back, taking a slow sip of his beer, never breaking eye contact. Then, out of nowhere, he swung his arm, sending the beer can flying across the train car. It clattered against the floor, spilling cheap alcohol everywhere. The old woman across from us flinched but didn't move. No one did. The few other passengers kept their heads down, pretending they hadn't seen anything. That's when I noticed something else. His arms. They were covered in needle marks. Fresh ones. His legs were bouncing uncontrollably, his hands flexing and unflexing, like he was wound too tight, ready to snap. I wanted to move, to switch seats, to get away from him. But then his head snapped toward me so fast it was inhuman. "What about you, sweetheart?" he asked. My throat went dry. "What? You ever kill anyone?" I shook my head quickly. "No." His grin widened. "You ever thought about it?" Jake tensed beside me, his hands curling into fists. "Dude, leave her alone." The man didn't even look at him. Instead, he leaned in closer, his breath reeking of alcohol and something sour, something rotten. "I think about it all the time," he whispered. I turned away, heart pounding, pretending I hadn't heard him. The train ride felt endless. The man wouldn't stop moving, shifting in his seat, tapping his fingers against the plastic armrest in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Tap, tap, tap. Jake and I stopped talking. We just sat there, rigid, waiting for our stop, willing time to move faster. Then the train slowed. Not our stop, but a small, deserted station. 2 passengers got off. No one got on. The man let out a slow, exaggerated sigh and stretched his arms. "Guess this is my stop." Relief flooded my chest as he stood up, swaying slightly. But then he stopped. His head turned toward me one last time. And he smiled. Not just any smile. It was too wide, his lips pulling back too far, his teeth gleaming under the flickering fluorescent lights. Like he was showing me something. "See you around, sweetheart." I said nothing. I just stared straight ahead as he stumbled off the train, vanishing into the dark. The doors hissed shut, and the train lurched forward again. Jake let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Jesus Christ." I nodded, still too tense to speak. I thought it was over. I thought we'd never see him again. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced down. "Unknown number. You looked scared back there." "I like that." My stomach dropped. I hadn't given him my number. I turned to Jake, my hand shaking, and showed him the screen. His face went pale. How the hell did he get your number? I had no idea. Then the train slowed again. Not for a stop. Not for another station. For something else. The train conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding tense, confused. Apologies for the delay. We've been asked to stop for an emergency situation. Jake and I exchanged uneasy glances. Outside, through the dirty window, I could barely make out the outline of a figure, standing on the tracks, staring at our train. My breath caught in my throat. No way, Jake whispered. The man. He was just standing there, his hands in his pockets, watching us. We weren't supposed to be able to see him. It was too dark, too far. But somehow, I knew. He was looking directly at me. A shiver ran down my spine. The train stayed still for what felt like forever. Then, finally, the intercom crackled again. We'll be resuming shortly. Apologies again for the delay. I didn't look back out the window. I didn't want to know if he was still there. The train lurched forward, the tracks grinding beneath us, pulling us away from that station. I thought about the text message. I thought about the way he had stared at me like he was memorizing my face. And I thought about the words he had whispered before getting off the train. See you around. I never took that train again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in a quiet room, my phone buzzes with an unknown number. And I don't have to look to know what it says. You looked scared back there. I like that. The station was nearly empty when I arrived. I had missed my stop. It was my own fault. I had dozed off, the soft hum of the train lulling me into sleep. By the time I woke up, I was 2 stops too far and stranded at a station that looked like it hadn't seen life in years. The digital clock on the wall flickered 2:17 a.m. The next train back wouldn't arrive for another hour. I sighed, adjusting my bag on my shoulder. The platform was dimly lit, the overhead lights buzzing faintly, casting long, unsettling shadows along the concrete. There was only one other person there. A man, standing a few feet away from the edge of the platform, perfectly still. Something about him made me uneasy. He was wearing thick sunglasses, even though it was the middle of the night, and he clutched a white cane in his hand, the kind blind people used. I would have ignored him if not for one thing. He wasn't using the cane. He wasn't tapping it against the ground, wasn't feeling his way around like someone who needed guidance. He was just holding it, like a prop. I glanced away, pretending I hadn't noticed, but something about the way he stood there, too rigid, too aware, sent a chill down my spine. The sound of distant footsteps echoed somewhere behind me, and for a moment, I felt relieved. Maybe another late traveler, someone who could make this place feel a little less empty. But the footsteps never arrived. They stopped abruptly, leaving only silence in their wake. I glanced back at the man with the cane. He was rocking slightly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his face tilted toward the tracks. Then, without warning, he lurched forward, like he was about to fall in. I took a step forward, my heart pounding. Hey. But before I could finish, he snapped upright, his head turning sharply in my direction. I froze. His sunglasses were still covering his eyes, but I could feel him looking at me, watching me. I swallowed hard, forcing a polite smile. Are you okay? His mouth curled into a grin. Why wouldn't I be? His voice was too smooth, too rehearsed, like he had practiced that exact response 1,000 times. I didn't answer. Instead, I took a slow step backward, putting more distance between us. He tilted his head. You seem nervous. His grin widened, stretching too far, like his skin didn't quite fit his face. My stomach twisted. Something was wrong with him. I glanced at the train schedule mounted on the wall. 57 minutes until the next train. Too long. I pulled out my phone, pretending to scroll, just to have something to focus on. Then, the tap, tap, tap of the cane against the ground. Slow. Deliberate. I peeked up. He was moving toward me. Not walking normally, hopping, in an unnatural, jerky rhythm, swinging his cane in wide, exaggerated arcs. Like he was playing a game. I stiffened. Do not react. Do not react. I turned away, willing myself to stay calm. The taps grew closer. Then, suddenly silence. I didn't dare look. Then I heard it. A whisper. I can see you, you know? A cold wave of terror crashed over me. I forced myself to keep looking at my phone. You're pretending not to notice me. My breath hitched. He was right behind me now. But I notice you. I bolted. I didn't think. I just ran. Down the platform, past the empty benches toward the farthest end of the station. My heartbeat was deafening, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally turned around, he was standing exactly where I had left him. But now he had removed his sunglasses, and his eyes were shut tight. Too tight, like they had been sewn shut. A sharp, nauseating chill ripped through me. Then he started running, not toward me, at the tracks. I gasped as he lurched forward, his arms outstretched, his grin never faltering. He was going to jump. Then, at the last second, he stopped, right at the edge, his shoes barely touching the yellow line. He tilted his head back, inhaling deeply, like he was savoring the moment. Then he turned his face toward me, even though his eyes were still shut. "You almost thought I was going to do it, didn't you?" he whispered. I backed away slowly, my body screaming at me to run. But then I saw something even worse. Beyond him, across the platform, was the reflection of the station in the glass of a vending machine. And in that reflection, his eyes were open, wide, unblinking, staring directly at me. A strangled gasp escaped my lips. I could see him, but he wasn't supposed to see me. Then he laughed, not loudly, not maniacally, just a soft, amused chuckle like we were sharing a private joke. My vision blurred with panic. A distant light appeared down the tracks. The next train was coming. I spun on my heel and ran. I didn't care if I looked insane. I just needed to get away from him. The train roared into the station, sending a burst of wind against my back. The second the doors slid open, I lunged inside, pushing past confused passengers. I turned, my chest rising and falling in frantic gasps. The man was gone. I scanned the platform, but it was completely empty. I almost thought I had imagined the whole thing. Then, just as the doors started to close, I saw it. A white cane, lying abandoned on the platform. And behind it, written in smeared dirt on the concrete, "I can see you." The train pulled away. I never took the late train again. But sometimes, when I'm waiting alone on a platform, I still hear it. The slow, rhythmic tap, tap, tap of a cane against the ground. And I know, he's still watching. And this time, his eyes are open. The last train home was mostly empty. That was why I had taken it. The express trains were always packed, and I hated feeling like a sardine, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers. The local train took longer, but at this hour, there were hardly any passengers. It was quiet, peaceful. At least, that's what I thought when I stepped into the car. At first, the only other passenger was a middle-aged businessman, sitting near the door, flipping through a newspaper. He barely looked up as I entered. I settled into a seat toward the back, placed my bag on my lap, and exhaled. The rhythmic clatter of the train against the tracks made me feel sleepy, and I let my head rest against the cool glass window. Then I noticed him, a man sitting about 5 rows ahead of me, slouched over in his seat. I hadn't seen him when I boarded. Had he been there the whole time? He was wearing a wrinkled suit, and his head was tilted down, hiding his face. His greasy black hair stuck to his forehead, damp with sweat. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching. Something about him made my skin crawl. I turned away, telling myself I was just being paranoid. He was probably just another exhausted commuter. The train continued on. The businessman got off at the next stop, leaving just me and him. I stared at my reflection in the window, trying to avoid looking at him directly. Then I heard it, a soft shuffling sound. I glanced up. He had moved. He was now sitting 3 rows closer, still slouched, still staring at his knees. I swallowed hard. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe he had already been sitting there. The train pulled into another station. The doors hissed open. Nobody got on. As soon as they closed, I heard it again. That same shuffling sound. I looked up. He was even closer. 1 row away. This time, his head wasn't tilted down anymore. He was looking right at me. His face was expressionless. His eyes were dark, sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. His mouth was slightly open, as if he was about to say something, but no words came out. A cold, sick feeling settled in my stomach. I stood up immediately and walked toward the opposite end of the car, forcing my steps to stay even. I sat down near the door and waited for the next stop. The train slowed, the brakes screeching against the tracks. I grabbed my bag, heart pounding. The second the doors slid open, I stood to step out. But then he moved too, faster than I expected. Too fast. He was standing beside me now, blocking my way. His smell hit me first, stale sweat and something sour, like rotting fruit. Up close, I could see his lips twitching, his pupils blown wide. "Are you getting off?" he asked. His voice was wrong. Low, scratchy, like someone who had spent years screaming until their vocal cords shredded. I hesitated for half a second too long. The doors slammed shut. The train lurched forward. I was trapped with him. I backed away slowly, gripping my bag like a shield. He just stood there, swaying slightly with the motion of the train. I glanced at the emergency intercom on the wall. I could press it, call for help, but before I could move, he did something that made my blood run cold. He smiled. Not a normal smile. It was too wide, his lips stretching unnaturally across his face. His teeth were small, yellowed, uneven. His jaw seemed too loose, like it could unhinge at any second. "You're alone now." My breath hitched. I didn't answer. The train was barreling through the tunnels now, the overhead lights flickering as we passed under broken fixtures. His head twitched slightly. "Do you believe in fate?" he whispered. My hands clenched around the strap of my bag. "I don't know you," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. He took a slow step closer. "But I know you." The lights flickered again, and for half a second, I swore his shadow stretched longer than it should have. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I was trapped. I needed to stay calm. "I don't know what you want," I said carefully. "But I don't have any money." He let out a choked laugh. "Money?" he echoed. "That's not why I'm here." I felt sick. I checked the map on the wall. One more stop. If I could just make it one more stop, I could run. Then he leaned forward, his mouth so close to my ear I could feel his breath. "You smell nice." I bolted. I didn't think. I just ran down the aisle, gripping the metal poles for balance as the train rattled around me. I reached the very last row of seats, my back pressed against the wall. He was still by the door, standing in the same spot. Then he did something even worse. He laughed again, but this time, his mouth didn't move. His lips were frozen in that awful smile, but the laugh, the wet, rattling sound of it, kept coming. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. No service. Of course. Then the train slowed. The final stop. I had never moved so fast in my life. The second the doors opened, I shoved past him, ignoring the way his fingers brushed against my arm as I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside the station, gasping for breath. When I turned back, expecting to see him following, he wasn't there. The train was still at the platform, the doors still open, but the car we had been in was completely empty. I checked my phone again. A single notification. Unknown number. We'll meet again. I never took that train again. But sometimes, when I walk alone at night, I feel it. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck. And once, just once, I swear I heard it again. That wet, awful laugh coming from the dark. The overnight train from Rome to Milan was supposed to be peaceful. Lucas and I had spent weeks backpacking through Italy, scraping by on cheap hostels and last-minute travel plans. It had been an incredible trip, but we were exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that makes your bones ache. By the time we reached the train station, we were barely speaking, too drained to do anything except board the train and collapse into our seats. The train itself was old, the kind with dim yellow lighting that flickered every now and then. The seats were stiff and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, even though smoking wasn't allowed. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of sweat, metal, and something vaguely chemical, like industrial cleaner that had failed to mask something worse. We were among the last to board, and most of the other passengers were already asleep, curled against the windows or slumped forward in their seats. A quiet hum filled the car, the sound of people breathing, the train wheels clicking against the tracks, and the occasional distant cough. Lucas and I found seats near the back, away from the handful of other travelers. That's when he spoke. Americani. The voice came from a few rows ahead, cutting through the quiet like a blade. I turned and saw him, a man in his late 50s, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit that looked like it had been bought secondhand. His thin, graying mustache twitched as he smiled at us, revealing yellowed teeth with gaps between them. His dark, sunken eyes gleamed under the dim light, and something about them made my stomach turn. Lucas, being too polite, nodded. "Yeah." The man's grin widened. "Too much. Too eager. I love Americans." His accent was thick, but his English was surprisingly good. "Where are you going?" Lucas hesitated. I didn't want to answer. I didn't like how the man was looking at us, how his eyes kept darting between Lucas and me, studying us like we were something more than just passing travelers. But Lucas, still oblivious, responded, Milan. The man nodded, rocking slightly in his seat, as if he had been waiting for that answer. Milan is beautiful, he said. You have a hotel? I stiffened. Why would he ask that? Lucas shifted beside me. Not yet. We were going to find one when we got there. The man leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. No. You must plan ahead. I swallowed hard. Something was wrong. I know a place, he continued. Not many tourists know about it. Very safe. Cheap. You will love it. Lucas nodded absent-mindedly, but I could feel my pulse quickening. That's okay, I said quickly. We'll figure it out when we arrive. The man's smile faltered for just a second. Then it returned, even wider than before. No, you don't understand, he said, shaking his head. I know the owner. I can call now, make a reservation. You will have no problems. I glanced at Lucas, willing him to see what I was seeing. That this was off. That this wasn't just some friendly old man trying to help tourists. But Lucas, too trusting, shrugged. I mean, how much is it? I wanted to shake him. The man grinned again. Very cheap. Very private. You will sleep well. He pulled out his phone and, before we could protest, started dialing a number. The air felt thick, suffocating. He muttered something in rapid Italian, his eyes flicking up to us every few seconds. I watched his hand. His fingers tapped against his knee in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Not nervous. Calculated. The call lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then he turned the phone toward us. They have a room for you. Perfect for a young couple. I stared at the screen. There was no number displayed. Just a blank screen. Like he hadn't called anyone at all. A cold wave of unease rolled through me. Where exactly is this place? I asked, my voice steady despite the fear crawling up my spine. The man waved his hand dismissively. Not far. Someone will meet you at the station. Someone will meet us. No. I shook my head. Thank you, but we're okay. For the first time, his expression changed. Something flickered behind his eyes. Something dark, calculating, impatient. Then, just as quickly, he smiled again. Of course. But if you change your mind. He reached into his pocket and handed Lucas a piece of paper. Address. You go, they will take care of you. Lucas took it reluctantly. I wanted to throw it out the window. The man leaned back in his seat, watching us. I didn't sleep. I kept my eyes on him the entire ride, pretending to rest, but never truly looking away. He never moved again, never spoke. But I knew he was still watching. When we finally pulled into Milan, I grabbed Lucas's hand and practically dragged him off the train. The man never moved. He just sat there, smiling, as we stepped onto the platform. Outside, under the fluorescent station lights, I grabbed the piece of paper from Lucas's hands and unfolded it. No hotel name, no website, just an address. A residential street. Not a business, not a hostel, just a random house. My stomach turned to ice. We need to leave. Now. Lucas finally saw the look on my face and nodded. We found a cheap but legitimate hotel near the station. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I searched the address online. No hotel. No guest house. Nothing. But there was something else. A news article. From 2 years ago. A missing couple. Last seen at the Milan train station. Last known location? The same residential address. My hands went ice cold. What if we had gone? Lucas whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't want to think about it. We left Milan that afternoon. I made Lucas throw away the paper. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I think about that man on the train. His too wide smile. His too persistent offer. And the way he just watched us leave, like it didn't matter. Like he knew he'd find someone else. Someone easier to convince.